Hi there, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Tim Gray TV. I'm Tim Gray, this time coming to you from Skagway in Alaska, and I wanted to talk about manual exposure. I've got a beautiful backdrop here, mountains with some trees, pine trees in the foreground coming across, and it's a beautiful scene, I think, but it also is a challenging scene in terms of overall exposure because we have snow on the mountains reflecting lots and lots of light, but then we have the pine trees for the most part on the hillside in the foreground in shadow. And so there's a lot of dynamic range there, but it's also a challenge in terms of exposure. Now I hear a lot of photographers talking about manual exposure and when you should versus don't necessarily need to use manual exposure. A common example is a bird in flight. If we have a bird in flight, let's assume, since we're in Alaska, a bald eagle, a proper exposure for those white feathers on the head is going to remain fixed when the sunlight is fixed or the overall lighting conditions are fixed. And so when the bird is flying in the sky versus in front of a dark forest, in front of the water, the overall exposure based on the camera's meter is going to change, but the actual exposure we want won't be changing. We'll allow the backdrop to go to whatever it's going to do. We want the proper exposure for, in that case, the bird. And the same thing applies here. I want to make sure that I'm holding the detail in the sunlight, on the snow, on those mountain peaks, regardless of how I frame the shot. Now, if I'm using a manual exposure mode, I'm able to overcompensate a challenge with a meter. In aperture priority mode, for example, as I pan up for more sky or down for more trees, the average lighting values in that frame will change and the camera is going to adjust the exposure accordingly. So even with exposure compensation, as I reframe the scene, I might end up with a not good exposure. I might lose, for example, too much detail up in the snow. If I use a manual exposure mode, I can lock in a good exposure, and no matter how I reframe that overall scene, as long as the light doesn't change, as long as clouds don't go over the sun, for example, I have a good exposure. So I recommend that you get more comfortable with manual exposure mode. Even, as I mentioned in a previous episode of Tim Gray TV, even if you need to start with aperture priority mode, for example, figure out a good exposure, then dial in manual mode and establish those exact same settings, that's perfectly fine as you're learning to use that manual exposure mode. But in a case like this, manual exposure can be a tremendous advantage in terms of being able to reframe the scene without having to compensate for that change in scene in terms of how the camera is metering the scene. So get a little bit more comfortable with manual exposure and use it in those tricky situations where you want to be able to reframe without changing your exposure. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Tim Gray TV.